Hello. Welcome back to STM Narratives. Before we begin, please comment where you are watching from and the time. It was a brisk fall afternoon in a small town called Greenridge, the kind of place where most folks knew each other and visitors were rare. The air was crisp, with a light wind that tugged at the last of the golden leaves on the maple trees. Inside the town's only diner, the Rusty Spoon, the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee lingered, mixing with the low murmur of conversations and the clinking of silverware against plates. Henry Davis, an elderly man in his early 80s, slowly walked down the narrow main street, his thin, weathered hands gripping the handle of his cane. His steps were slow, deliberate, and each step carried a slight wobble, as the years had taken their toll on his legs. His face, though aged and deeply lined, still held a certain warmth. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his clothes, though a bit worn, were clean and carefully pressed. He had once been a mechanic in his younger years, and although his hands now shook slightly with age, they still bore the roughness of decades spent fixing engines and machines. Henry hadn't been to the diner in quite some time, not since his wife, Margaret, passed away 3 years ago. They used to go every Sunday after church, sitting at the booth by the window, sharing a slice of apple pie. He missed those days more than anything. But today was different. Today, he decided to step inside that familiar place again, hoping to treat himself to a warm meal and perhaps a moment of nostalgia. The bell above the diner's door jingled as Henry entered, drawing the attention of a few patrons. He stood for a moment in the doorway, taking in the room, the faded red booths, the retro jukebox in the corner, and the black and white photographs of the town from decades past lining the walls. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of belonging, like the diner still remembered him and Margaret. But that feeling was short-lived. Henry made his way toward the counter, his cane tapping softly against the floor, and took a seat on one of the old leather stools. He smiled at the waitress, a young woman in her 20s with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. Her name tag read Lisa. "Afternoon," Henry said softly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tremble of age. Lisa barely glanced at him, too busy taking the order of a group of young men at the other end of the counter. Henry waited patiently, not wanting to rush her, but minutes ticked by, and still, she didn't come to him. The other patrons began to notice. He cleared his throat, hoping to catch her attention, but instead, a middle-aged man in the back of the diner let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Look at that old guy," the man said to his friend, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's probably so old he doesn't even know where he is." Henry felt his face flush, his hands tightening around the handle of his cane. He lowered his eyes to the counter, pretending not to hear, but the words stung like sharp thorns. His heart sank a little. He had never liked being the center of attention, and now, it seemed like the entire diner was watching him, waiting for something embarrassing to happen. Finally, Lisa came over, though her expression was far from friendly. She stood in front of him, her arms crossed, tapping her foot as if she had better things to do. "What do you want?" she asked flatly, not even bothering to hide her impatience. Henry looked up at her, offering a small, hopeful smile. "Could I get a coffee, please? And maybe a sandwich, whatever's easiest." Lisa rolled her eyes and turned her head toward the kitchen. "Hey, Jimmy, got an order for the old man. Make it quick." Henry's smile faltered. He wasn't sure why she was being so short with him, but he didn't want to cause any trouble. He'd just get his meal and leave quietly, he thought, as Lisa went to fetch his coffee. Another man sitting a few stools down, a burly truck driver with a greasy cap, snickered. "You sure you can even chew a sandwich, old man?" he called out. "Might want to ask for soup instead. Your dentures might fall out." A few other patrons chuckled at the cruel joke, but Henry didn't respond. His hands trembled slightly as he sat there, his eyes focused on the scratches on the counter. He had heard jokes about his age before, but today, the cruelty felt heavier, more personal. Maybe it was because he was alone, or maybe because the town he had spent his entire life in now seemed so unfamiliar, so cold. When Lisa returned, she slammed a cup of coffee down in front of him, some of the liquid sloshing over the rim. She didn't apologize. "Anything else?" she asked, as though she was hoping he'd say no. Henry's throat felt tight. He simply shook his head and whispered, "No, thank you." But just as Lisa was about to walk away, the owner of the diner, a burly man named Carl, emerged from the back. He took one look at Henry and frowned. "Hey, Lisa," Carl called, his deep voice booming through the diner. "Why are you serving that guy? He's just gonna sit here and take up space all day. Old folks don't tip anyway." Henry's eyes widened, and he felt a lump form in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air. The few people who had been polite enough not to stare before now turned their full attention to him. Carl walked over, wiping his hands on his apron, and looked down at Henry with an expression that was a mix of annoyance and disdain. "You know, we got paying customers who need these seats, old man," Carl said gruffly. "Maybe you should just head on home. You probably don't have money to pay anyway." Henry's face turned crimson with embarrassment. He reached into his pocket with shaky hands and pulled out a few crumpled bills. I have money," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carl snorted. "Yeah, well, we don't need it." Just then, a voice broke through the tension, firm yet calm. "I'll pay for his meal." Everyone turned to see a young man in his 30s standing near the entrance, his dark eyes fixed on Carl. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a leather jacket and jeans. He walked over to the counter with purpose and stood beside Henry, who looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. The young man pulled out his wallet, placing a few crisp bills on the counter. "Give him whatever he wants," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Carl opened his mouth to protest, but something in the young man's gaze made him think twice. Grumbling under his breath, Carl snatched up the money and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the diner in a stunned silence. The stranger turned to Henry, his expression softening. "Mind if I join you?" Henry nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The young man sat down next to him, extending a hand. "I'm Jake," he said with a smile. Henry shook his hand, his own still trembling. "Henry," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I don't know how to." Jake held up a hand. "You don't have to thank me. No one should be treated like that. Not ever." For the first time that afternoon, Henry smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes. The weight of the insults and the embarrassment began to lift, replaced by the warmth of the stranger's kindness. Over the next hour, they sat together, talking about life, the town, and memories of better days. Jake listened intently as Henry spoke of his late wife, Margaret, and the life they had built together. He shared stories of working as a mechanic, of raising two sons who had long since moved away, and of the loneliness that had settled in after Margaret's passing. As they talked, the other patrons in the diner quietly returned to their meals, no longer interested in mocking the elderly man who had now found a friend. When the sandwich finally arrived, late but better than never, Jake made sure Henry had everything he needed. They ate together, and for the first time in a long while, Henry felt less alone. The weight of the years, the isolation, and the bitterness of loss seemed to fade, if only for a little while, in the presence of a simple act of kindness. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Henry turned to Jake, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said quietly, "but I'll never forget it." Jake smiled warmly. "Sometimes, all it takes is a little kindness to make a big difference. Take care of yourself, Henry." With that, Jake paid the bill and walked Henry to the door, holding it open for him as he stepped out into the cool afternoon air. As Henry made his way down the street, his cane tapping against the pavement, he felt a warmth in his chest that the autumn chill couldn't touch. For the first time in a long while, he believed in the goodness of people again. And as for the rusty spoon, the diner remained unchanged, a place where some might still judge others by their age or appearance. But for Henry, it no longer mattered. He had been reminded that, even in the unlikeliest of places, kindness could still shine through, and that was enough.